In 1969, we walked on the moon with a guidance computer weaker than the key fob in your pocket. 57 years later, with technology beyond anything those engineers could have dreamed of, it took everything we had just to fly around the moon and come home. No landing at all. Apollo 11 got there in 8 years. Artemis has been trying for almost a decade. And when Artemis II finally lifted off on the 1st of April 2026, the story it told was not the one most of us expected. This was not a mission that went wrong. It was simply harder than anyone expected. And not because we forgot how. It was harder because everything else had changed. Over the next half hour, we are going to trace exactly why, step by step, the leaks that grounded a rocket, the knowledge that quietly died with the people who carried it, the money and the politics behind a deliberately weaker machine, and a single moment farther from Earth than any human being has ever traveled, when a crew stopped to leave a name on the surface of the moon. Start with the part that should embarrass us. In 1961, a young president stood in front of Congress and promised to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. 8 years later, almost to the month, 2 Americans were walking on it. Now compare that to today. The Artemis program was announced in 2017. Nearly a full decade has passed, and until this year, no crew had left Earth on it at all. Same country, same agency, far better tools. And yet the second time around, the clock has moved so much slower. That gap is the whole mystery of this video. And the strange thing is, it starts on the ground, long before anyone gets near space. Because getting Artemis II off the launch pad was a fight. During a fueling test early in 2026, engineers detected liquid hydrogen escaping where it never should. Hydrogen is the smallest molecule there is, chilled to around minus 252 degrees Celsius, and sealing it is one of the hardest things in all of rocketry. They stopped the flow when the readings climbed past the safety line. Then, on the night of the 21st of February, a second problem surfaced, a helium leak buried deep inside the rocket's upper stage. And here is the detail that tells you how thin the margins really are. The tank they needed to reach could only be accessed back inside the assembly building. So NASA rolled the entire vehicle, a stack roughly 98 meters, about 322 feet, tall, all the way home to fix it. Sit with that image for a second. That rollback was a journey of about 4 miles that took close to 10.5 hours, all because of a clogged seal at a connector no bigger than the tip of your finger. One tiny flaw, and a mission to the moon slips back by weeks. This is what harder than expected actually looks like. It is not one dramatic explosion. It is 1,000 small, unglamorous ways for a machine of this complexity to say, "not yet." There is a deeper reason those small failures kept appearing, and it has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with practice. A rocket as complex as the Space Launch System had been flying only about once every 3 years. When a team touches something that rarely, the hands forget the rhythm. NASA's own answer to this is blunt. They want to fly far more often, a target of roughly 1 flight every 10 months. not to show off, but to rebuild the muscle memory a program loses when it sits idle. Apollo understood this instinctively. The giant Saturn V first flew in late 1967, and less than 2 years later it was carrying Apollo 11 to the moon. The flights came thick and fast. Artemis, by contrast, had launched its last big rocket back in 2022 and then gone quiet. Skill, it turns out, is perishable. And here I want to pause for just a second, because a story like this was never about one country. When Apollo 11 landed, it was watched by more people at the same moment than any event in human history, on every continent at once. So I am honestly curious how far this one reaches. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? Just drop your country below. I read them, and I love seeing how far these journeys travel. Which leaves us with an uncomfortable question, and it is the one everyone in the comments keeps asking. If we did it in 1969 with a computer weaker than a modern car key, did we actually forget how to do this? The answer is stranger than a simple yes or no. We didn't forget how, but something was still lost. Let us kill the easy answer first, because it is the one you hear everywhere. People say we lost the ability to go to the moon, as if the knowledge simply evaporated. That is not true. We still have the blueprints. We have the manuals, the schematics, the engineering drawings of the Saturn V, sitting in archives right now. If forgetting were the problem, we could just open the folder and start building. So the puzzle is not missing paper. The puzzle is something you cannot keep in a folder at all. Because most of how you actually build a Saturn V never lived on paper in the first place. It lived in people. Thousands of engineers and technicians carried the real know-how in their heads. The little trick to seat a valve just right, the true tolerance that works on the factory floor instead of the one written in the spec, the feel for when a weld is good. That kind of knowledge is almost never written down, because the people who have it do not think of it as knowledge. It is just how they work. And when those people retire or pass away, it goes with them. The drawings survive. The 1,000 small secrets in the builders' minds did not. This is why you cannot simply rebuild the old rocket, even if you wanted to. The Saturn V was a product of 1960s material, 1960s machining, 1960s design choices. Recreating all of that today, finding people who can make those exact parts the exact old way, would actually cost more than designing a fresh rocket with modern tools and better materials. The past is not a shelf you can pull down. It has to be rebuilt from scratch, and rebuilding is slow. You can watch this same erosion in something painfully specific. The original, highest quality recordings of the Apollo 11 moonwalk, the master tapes, were reused. In the years after the landing, NASA was recycling storage tape by the hundreds of thousands, and the original slow scan format of humanity's first steps on another world was recorded over. A 2009 investigation confirmed it. Now the footage itself is not gone. The broadcast survived, and it was digitally restored from archival copies. But the pristine originals were written over, quietly, without malice. simply because at the time nobody thought they would matter this much. And that is the whole lesson in miniature. Even with the Saturn V blueprints perfectly intact, the things that cannot be written on paper, the habits, the instincts, the master formats, are exactly the things that fade first. What lives in people and routines slips away before what sits in a drawing does. Think of it like a family recipe. You can copy the ingredients and the steps onto a card and hand it to a stranger, and they still will not make it taste right, because the recipe was never really the recipe. The recipe was in the cook's hands, so no, we did not forget how to go to the moon. But part of the answer really is that something was lost, just not the part everyone assumes. And I suspect a lot of you know this feeling in your own life. If you have ever carried some skill in your own hands that you could never fully put into words, a recipe, a craft, a trick of the trade only you seem to know, do me a favor and type the word hands in the comments. I have a feeling there are far more of you out there than anyone would ever guess. Knowledge, though, is only half the story. The other half is written in dollars and in politics. Here is a fact that sounds like a mistake. The rocket carrying Artemis II, the space launch system, is more powerful at liftoff than the Saturn V that carried Apollo. It produces around 39 meganewtons of thrust, about 8.8 million pounds of force, roughly 15% more than the Saturn V ever did. And yet it sends far less to the moon. The Saturn V could push about 48.6 tons onto a path toward the moon. This version of SLS can manage only around 27 tons, close to half. So the modern rocket is stronger off the pad, but weaker where it counts, on the long road out. That is not a failure of engineering. It is a snapshot of a choice. And it is worth being precise, because this is exactly where people get it wrong. That half the mass gap is true only for the first version of SLS, the one flying now with its modest upper stage. Later versions already on the drawing board would push roughly 38 tons, then more than 46, closing the distance with Saturn V. So weaker is not a permanent verdict on the machine. It is a description of the opening move. The real reason the first move looks so modest is not physics. It is the checkbook. Because the two programs were funded on completely different planets. Apollo, adjusted to today's money, cost somewhere around $257 billion. At its peak in the mid-1960s, it was eating more than half of everything NASA had, roughly 3 out of every $5. And at the very top, about 4.5% of the entire federal budget. Today, all of NASA is less than half of 1% of that budget. Read those two numbers back to back, and the paradox of this whole story finally cracks open. We are trying to reach the moon for a fraction of what it cost the first time, and quietly expecting it to be easier. Put the price tags side by side and it gets sharper. Apollo spent that $257 billion and put boots on the moon 6 times. The Artemis program has spent around $93 billion through 2025 by NASA's own Inspector General, and each launch of the rocket and its capsule runs about $4.1 billion. Same destination, roughly the same distance. But this time attempted on a slimmer budget with a fraction of the old political will. And still, somehow, we assumed it would come quicker. The money did not just shrink, it changed shape. That change of shape is where the politics comes in. Apollo had a single, ruthless engine driving it, beat the Soviet Union. When that race ended, the money had to be defended year after year in Congress. And a program that cannot point to a finish line has to survive another way. So NASA spread the work. Factories and contracts were placed across many states, and the new rocket reused engines left over from the space shuttle. This kept jobs alive and kept the votes needed to keep funding flowing. But every one of those choices tied the designer's hands a little tighter. The rocket we got is partly a machine and partly a map of which districts needed the work. And that has a real consequence in space. Because SLS cannot heave a whole mission to the moon in one shot the way the Saturn V did. The plan has to be broken into pieces, separate launches, separate spacecraft, separate companies, even refueling in orbit. Every extra piece is another thing that has to work, another seam that can leak, another handoff that can slip. Complexity is not a side effect here. It is baked in from the first design meeting. To feel the scale of it, hold one last comparison in your head. The entire NASA budget today is, in the language of federal spending, a rounding error. You could erase all of it and the nation's finances would barely twitch. That is the strange arithmetic of going back to the moon in our era. Not too little talent, not lost blueprints. Just a fraction of the will, spread thin across a map, asked to do something even harder than the first time. Knowledge, money, politics. Those are the reasons it was hard. Now let us watch what that difficulty actually looked like. 40,000 kilometers above your head, on the morning of the 1st of April, 2026. If you think this video deserves more attention, please click the hype button below. Each hype will help this video get recommended more often. After all the leaks and the rollbacks and the years of waiting, it finally happened. On the evening of the 1st of April, 2026, at 6:35 in the evening Eastern Time, the Space Launch System roared off Pad 39B at the Kennedy Space Center. Around 39 meganewtons of thrust pressed 4 human beings back into their seats at up to 4 times the force of gravity. And for the first time ever, those 4 people were riding inside Orion, the capsule built to carry crews back into deep space. After everything, the hard part was behind them. The harder part was ahead. You should know their names because this story keeps coming back to them. Reed Wiseman was the commander. Victor Glover flew as pilot. Alongside them were mission specialists, Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen, Hansen representing the Canadian Space Agency. 4 people sealed inside a cabin about the size of a small camper, aimed at a place no human had visited in over half a century. But they did not go straight for the moon. The first full day was a shakedown cruise, a slow, deliberate test drive in a high orbit around Earth that reached out nearly 46,000 miles. They check the systems that keep people alive, and some of those systems behave strangely up there. Carbon dioxide, for instance, does not simply drift away in weightlessness the way it does in your living room. It pools around your face unless the ship actively pushes it clear, so the crew put the scrubbers through their paces. Then they practice something that will matter enormously on future flights, flying close to another object in space. To do it, they use the spent upper stage of their own rocket as a target. Over roughly 70 minutes, the crew hand-flew Orion to within about 30 feet, 9 meters, of that drifting stage. Think about what that means. This was the first time in decades that humans had manually steered a moon-bound spacecraft up to a target in orbit. And it was a rehearsal for a day that has not come yet. The day an Orion will have to find and meet a lunar lander waiting in orbit around the moon. They were not just testing hardware, they were relearning a skill carefully with their own hands. And the ship fought them a little, the way it had on the ground. A valve on a water tank jammed at launch, and the crew had to drain at least 7 liters of water into backup bags to manage it. A helium leak, the kind used to pressurize the propulsion system, measured about 10 times higher than engineers had expected, still safely within limits, but enough that NASA already knows the service module of a future flight will need a deep redesign of those valves. None of it was dangerous. All of it was information. Every stuck valve on this flight is a valve that gets fixed before a crew ever tries to land. There was something else happening down on Earth during all of this, something you could feel in the reaction. A whole generation who had watched Apollo 11 as children were now watching this launch with children of their own. For one evening, the old feeling came back, the sense that we were reaching outward again. With the ship checked out and Earth shrinking behind them, the crew lit the engine that would carry them somewhere no human radio signal had reached in 50 years. To leave Earth behind, Orion had to light its main engine for one long, precise burn. That engine, built in Europe and reusing a design flown on the space shuttle, fired for about 6 minutes and threw the ship onto what is called a free return trajectory. It is an elegant piece of celestial mechanics. Rather than fighting all the way there and all the way back, the crew let the gravity of the moon and the Earth do the work. A loop that naturally curves you around the moon and swings you home, even if the engine never fires again. It is the same kind of path that quietly saved the crew of Apollo 13. After the burn, Orion was moving at roughly 36,500 kilometers per hour, about 22,670 miles per hour, and the moon was no longer a light in the sky. It was a destination getting closer by the hour. Out there, past the invisible shield of Earth's magnetic field, the environment turns harsh in a way you cannot see or feel. Radiation, both the constant sleet of cosmic rays from the galaxy and the bursts thrown out by the sun, grows many times stronger than anything at ground level. To measure exactly what that does to a body, Orion carried an experiment called Avatar. It is essentially an organ on a chip, a device about the size of a memory stick, lined with living human bone marrow cells. And here is the detail that stays with you. Those cells were donated by the 4 astronauts themselves. Their own tissue rode along with them, so this radiation experiment quite literally flew with its owners. It is how NASA hopes to learn what deep space does to us without waiting decades to find out the hard way. Then there is the thing that genuinely changed how we see this journey. Artemis II carried the first laser communication system ever flown on a crewed mission to the moon. Instead of the old radio links, a beam of light could send data home at up to 260 megabits per second, fast enough to stream sharp 4K video all the way from the moon's neighborhood. And yes, that is megabits, not megabytes, a distinction the sharpest viewers will insist on, and rightly so. The system was built by NASA's Goddard Center together with the Lincoln Laboratory at MIT. To put the leap in perspective, Apollo talked to Earth through radio antennas across a global network, sending back grainy signals. 57 years later, the moon can send home clearer pictures than most living rooms on Earth can stream. And some of those pictures were quietly breathtaking. On the second day of the flight, Commander Wiseman aimed a camera back through a window and caught Earth as a dark globe rimmed in a thin blade of light. The exposure was pushed so far that it picked up the shimmer of the aurora, the faint glow of zodiacal light scattered by dust in the solar system, and the bright point of Venus hanging nearby. It was chosen as the astronomy picture of the day. Not a rendering, not a simulation. Real light, caught by a human hand, beamed home on a laser. But the closer they drifted toward the moon, the closer they came to a line no crew had crossed since Apollo, the moment when the moon itself would cut them off from home. Every spacecraft that loops around the far side of the moon goes silent. And it is the far side, not the dark side. That whole face gets just as much sunlight as ours. We simply never see it from Earth. As Orion swung behind the moon, the entire body of that world slid between the crew and home, and the radio went quiet. For about 40 minutes, 4 people were more cut off than anyone else alive. No signal, no voices from mission control, nothing but the ship and the cratered ground sliding past below. And then, right at the edge, the moon released them, and the signal came flooding back. But it was where they went that broke a record standing for more than half a century. On the 6th of April 2026, Artemis II reached a point about 406,773 kilometers from Earth, roughly 252,757 miles. That is the farthest any human being has ever traveled from home. It edged past the mark set by Apollo 13 back in 1970 by around 6,600 kilometers. To feel that number, picture this. 6,600 kilometers is close to half an Earth laid end to end. Added on top of a record that already stood for 50 years, and from out there, our entire world had shrunk to a pale dot you could hide behind your thumb. Every person who has ever lived that far away, small enough to cover with one hand. And it was precisely here, at the farthest point humans have ever reached, that the mission stopped being about engineering. On behalf of the crew, Jeremy Hansen proposed names for 2 craters on the moon. One they called Integrity, after the name the crew had given their Orion capsule the previous autumn. The other they called Carol. Carol Wiseman was the wife of the commander, Reed Wiseman. She was a nurse who cared for the most fragile newborns in intensive care, and she died of cancer in 2020 at the age of 46. She did not live to see her husband fly to the moon. Now her name is a permanent part of it. The crater Carol is a small feature, about 6 kilometers across, and it sits on the near side of the moon, the side that faces us. That detail matters more than it sounds. Most people honored on the moon are honored on features we can never see with our own eyes. But Carol is a young, bright little mark on the face we look at every clear night. Close enough that her family can point a backyard telescope at the sky and actually find the spot that carries her name. A name that illness took far too early is now written on the one surface that has watched over every human who ever lived, and it will be there long after all of us are gone. This is the part no camera on a robot could ever have given us. Inside the cabin, weightless, the commander and Christina Koch were seen wiping away tears, the moment carried live back to Earth. That is human connection. And it is exactly why we still send people instead of only machines. So let me hand the next part to you. There are 2 ways to reach the moon: Apollo's all-out sprint, or Artemis's slow, patient build towards staying. Which one do you think history will decide was right? Tell me in the comments. I read them. Because moments like the one behind the moon are the whole argument for doing this with people at all. And if the story of that name left on the moon moved you even a little, do something small in return. Tap the like button and share this video with one person who grew up looking up at that same moon. It genuinely helps this kind of careful human storytelling reach the people who would love it. And if you want to ride the rest of this journey out with the crew, subscribe and stay with me. And then, almost as if the universe had timed it, the moon slid fully across the face of the sun and gave the crew a view no human being had ever seen. We have all seen a total solar eclipse from the ground, or at least photos of one. Nobody had ever seen one from here. As Orion passed into the moon's shadow on the 6th of April, the moon moved across the sun and blotted it out for close to 57 minutes, far longer than any eclipse on Earth, revealing the sun's ghostly outer atmosphere, the corona streaming into the black. And in that sudden darkness, something quiet and strange happened. Planets appeared. Saturn, Mars, Mercury, and Venus emerged in the deep sky, a small parade of worlds hanging in the dark. This was the first time human eyes had watched a total eclipse, not from Earth, but from the space between Earth and the moon. The sun switched off for nearly an hour, and 4 planets stepping silently out of the dark to keep the crew company. What struck the crew most, though, was how the moon itself stopped being a picture and started being a place. Christina Koch described the landscape shifting in color as light from Earth crept across it, the surface turning from a hard electric gray toward soft olive and brown. Using the geology training they had drilled for years, the crew picked out features by eye. One of them is a vast bruise on the boundary between the near and far sides, a basin about 1,000 kilometers across that looks, in the right light, almost like a kiss left on the moon's cheek. They were not reading these things off a map. They were seeing them as observers, the way a traveler finally sees a country they had only ever read about. Then Wiseman captured an image that reached back nearly 6 decades. He photographed the Earth sinking behind the edge of the moon, an Earthset, and it immediately called to mind the famous Earthrise photo taken by the crew of Apollo 8 in 1968. It is worth being exact here, because it matters. Apollo 8 did not just fly past the moon. It entered orbit and circled it 10 times. Artemis II, by contrast, looped around on that free return path. And this is also why this crew traveled farther than any Apollo astronaut ever did. Their flight happened to line up with the moon sitting near the far end of its own orbit, so a path that swung them around the outside of the moon carried them beyond every previous record. Going farther was not a sign they were braver or better than Apollo. It was geometry. What was not geometry was the light itself. None of these frames were computer-generated. They were real photons caught by a human hand and sent home on a beam of laser light, the moon sending back sharper images than most living rooms on Earth will ever display. And be honest with me for a moment. 4 people just watched the sun go dark from the empty space between 2 worlds, with a line of planets stepping quietly out of the black behind it. If that sounds almost too strange to be real, comment the number 4 below, 1 for each of them, and stay right where you are. Because the crew were not only there to witness, they were there to find things, and part of what they saw in that shadow had never been recorded from this close before. What Artemis II actually found. During the eclipse, with the near surface of the moon thrown into shadow, the crew noticed something almost too quick to catch. Tiny flashes of light blinking on the dark ground and vanishing. They were watching micrometeorites, specks of rock traveling thousands of miles per hour, slam into the moon and flash into vapor on impact. Over their time in that shadow, the crew counted and reported around 6 such strikes back to Houston, calling it out in real time as at least 4, maybe 6. And this is exactly the kind of moment a certain style of video would slap the word deadly onto. It was not deadly. It was a discovery. Those flashes were not a threat hanging over the crew. They were data, a rare chance to watch the moon being quietly bombarded in real time. The precise kind of information you need before you build anything permanent on that surface. Not everything they dealt with was cosmic, though. Some of it was very human and a little undignified. The system that handles waste and water aboard the ship malfunctioned more than once, and the crew had to fall back on their backup plans and improvise. This is where Christina Koch's background as an electrical engineer earned its keep as the crew worked the problem and kept things running. Engineers repairing their own ship in the middle of a flight to the moon. It is not glamorous, but it is real, and it is a reminder that even now, spaceflight is people solving stubborn problems with their hands, hundreds of thousands of kilometers from the nearest hardware store. And then there was the small passenger that had nothing to do with engineering at all. Bolted somewhere in the cabin was a plush zero-gravity indicator, the little toy that floats when the ship reaches weightlessness. And this one was named Rise. It was not designed by an artist at the agency. It was drawn by a second grader named Lucas Ye, around 8 years old, who won a national moon mascot contest that drew roughly 2,600 entries, with the crew choosing the winner themselves. And tucked aboard the same spacecraft was a memory card carrying about 5.6 million names. Real names submitted by ordinary people who wanted a piece of themselves to make the trip. Sit with that for a second. An entire flight to the moon, built by thousands of engineers and costing billions, still made room for the imagination of an 8-year-old and the names of millions of strangers. All of it points back to the same idea. These stumbles, the stuck valves, the bulky plumbing, the leaks, are not signs of failure. They are the entire reason a test flight exists. You send a crew around the moon precisely so you can find every one of these problems here now, while everyone comes home safe, instead of discovering them for the first time when people are trying to land. 10 days after leaving Earth, though, the hardest part was still ahead. Because in spaceflight, getting there has never been the dangerous part. Coming home is. The most dangerous thing this crew did was not launching, and it was not flying behind the moon. It was re-entry. And the way they came home was shaped by a scare from the last flight. When the uncrewed Artemis I returned in 2022, inspectors found its heat shield had not held up the way anyone wanted. The protective material, called Avcoat, had cracked and worn away at more than 100 spots. The cause turned out to be subtle. As the shield heated, gases produced inside it could not escape quickly enough through the charred outer layer, so pressure built up and pieces broke off. So for Artemis II, NASA changed the plan. Instead of skipping across the top of the atmosphere like stone on a pond, a technique some accounts wrongly attached to this flight, the crew came in on a steeper, more direct path. The goal was simple: spend less time in the zone of most intense heat and protect the very shield they were counting on. The numbers of that descent are almost hard to believe. Orion struck the atmosphere at nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour, somewhere around 24,000 miles per hour, roughly 33 times
32 seconds into the flight.
At that velocity, the air in front of the capsule does not warm up so much as violently compress, heating until it glows into plasma. And it is compression, not friction, that does it. A distinction the physics-minded in the audience will appreciate. That sheath of plasma cut off radio contact entirely for about 6 minutes of blackout. Then, right on cue, small drogue parachutes bit into the air, and 3 enormous main chutes opened above the capsule, each one spanning about 116 feet across, roughly 35 meters, easing the ship down toward the water. NASA would spend the following weeks carefully assessing how the redesigned shield had actually performed. And it is worth remembering that this part has never gotten easier. Coming home from the moon has been the most dangerous stretch of any lunar flight since Apollo, because you arrive moving at nearly the speed it takes to escape Earth entirely. And all of that energy has to be shed as heat in a matter of minutes. Apollo faced the same brutal physics. The difference now is not that we made it safe. It is that we understood the risk well enough to redesign the way in, and then trusted the crew to ride it down. It came down on the 10th of April, 2026, a little after 5 in the evening Pacific time, into the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego, California. Not, as some retellings claim, out west of Baja California. A Navy ship, the USS John P. Murtha, moved in to recover the capsule and its crew. In total, the 4 of them had traveled something like 695,000 miles, well over 1,000,000 kilometers, in 10 days. When the signal finally broke back through the plasma blackout and the voices from the capsule returned, you could feel the whole thing exhale. And when Orion settled safely onto the ocean, it closed more than just a 10-day flight. It closed more than half a century in which no human being had gone anywhere near the moon. The crew was home. And if you have made it all the way here with them, through the leaks, the silence behind the moon, and this white-knuckle ride home through the fire, then you are exactly who this channel is made for. Take 1 second to hit that like button. Share this with someone who still believes reaching for the moon matters, and subscribe so you are here when we follow this road all the way to the surface. But the mission had really been about a question much bigger than 10 days. Why this whole thing was so much harder than 1969, and whether that was ever a bad sign at all. Why it was harder and why that was the plan. So here, finally, is the answer the title promised. Apollo and Artemis were never really trying to do the same thing. Apollo was a sprint to plant a flag. Speed was everything. Cost was almost no object. And a great deal of risk was acceptable, because the entire point was to get there before the Soviet Union did. Artemis is a different kind of thing altogether. Its goal is not to visit, but to build something that lasts. A foundation to stay, with science and infrastructure and a way to keep going back. And it has to do all of that with a fraction of the money, far less appetite for risk, and in a world that has completely changed. Of course it is slower, of course it is more tangled. The difficulty is not a symptom that something went wrong. The difficulty is the price of building something meant to be permanent. And there is a reason it is worth that price. The true destination is not the flat, easy ground near the moon's equator where Apollo landed. It is the South Pole, and specifically the floors of craters there that sunlight has never touched, permanently shadowed regions so cold in the deepest traps that temperatures fall toward minus 240 degrees Celsius. In that eternal cold, ancient water, ice has been preserved, and we do not know this by guessing. Back in 2009, a NASA mission called LCROSS deliberately slammed into one of those dark craters and measured water ice right there in the plume of debris it kicked up, making up a few percent of the material. That ice is the whole game. Split it with electricity and you get oxygen to breathe and hydrogen for fuel, which could one day turn the moon into a filling station on the way to Mars. But reaching that pole demands a far trickier approach than Apollo ever attempted. That is also why this has become a race with real stakes. China has set a stated goal of landing its own astronauts on the moon by around 2030, developing a new rocket, lander, and crew craft to do it. And the resource-rich South Pole sits at the center of everyone's plans. And any honest telling has to include India, which too many accounts leave out. An instrument built by NASA and flown aboard India's Chandrayaan-1 in 2008 helped confirm water on the moon in the first place. Then, in 2023, India's Chandrayaan-3 became the first craft ever to land softly near the lunar South Pole, close to 70 degrees south, making India the fourth nation to achieve a soft landing on the moon. And it did so in the very region Artemis is now aiming for. Around all of this sits a quiet contest of frameworks, with the American-led Artemis Accords on one side and a China and Russia partnership on the other, all of them working under the old Outer Space Treaty. The path forward has already shifted to match reality. In February 2026, NASA redefined the next flight. Artemis II, once expected to be a landing, was reshaped into a crude test in low orbit around the Earth, sometime around late 2027, a chance to prove out the new landing vehicles being built by SpaceX and Blue Origin before anyone rides one down. The first actual crewed landing has moved to Artemis IV, aimed at roughly 2028 and the South Pole itself. Guiding much of this is the agency's new administrator, Jared Isaacman, who took office at the end of 2025 and has pushed to standardize the fleet and fly more often, betting that refueling ships in orbit is the real road to Mars. None of it is fast. All of it is aimed at staying. Because we did not come back to plant one more flag and walk away. We came back to stay, and staying, it turns out, was always going to be the hard part. Which brings us back to where we started, and to the number 57. If you've watched this far, it means you're genuinely interested. Don't just like it, hype it up too. It only takes a few seconds, but it will help this video go much further. 57 years was never a measure of how far we fell behind. It was the distance between two completely different ambitions. Between running to the moon to touch it once, and returning to build a place we never have to leave. The leaks, the smaller budget, the slow and careful pace. None of it means we grew weaker than the people of 1969. It is simply the shape of a homecoming designed so that, this time, we never have to retreat. The first time, we went to prove we could. This time, we are going to stay. And everything that made it harder is exactly what it costs to make it last. If you want to follow this road all the way to the South Pole with me, consider subscribing, and I will see you farther out.